All right, so today I wanted to continue in Ecclesiastes. So we're going to be in chapter 2 today, if you want to turn there. The toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. I want to make a point because we've talked about the word vanity and how we understand it to mean meaningless, but the word here in Ecclesiastes that uses is a Hebrew word that translates to the word vapor or smoke. This is what the author is telling us all of life is. It's smoke. Trying to grasp at the value of life is trying to hold smoke in your hand. It's something you can never reach for, never actually attain. It's something that's there in your vision, but as soon as you go to grab it, you find that your hand is still empty. He's saying all of life is like grasping at smoke. It is pointless, a completely pointless endeavor. Verse 12, so I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in the darkness. And yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity, for the wise of the fool there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me. For all is vanity and striving after the wind. So he talks about how you gain more through wisdom than in foolishness. And he talks about how he retains his wisdom through all of these endeavors, and he finds that walking in light gets you more in life than walking in darkness. But at the end of it all, everyone dies. Whether you're wise, whether you're foolish, whether you walk in light, whether you walk in darkness, which, by the way, if you're not picking up on the symbolism, he's equating to being equal, right? Walking in light is walking in wisdom. Walking in darkness is walking in foolishness. But he talks about how fools die and the wise people die. And at the end of the day, nobody remembers any of it. Whether you lived a life of wisdom or whether you lived a life of foolishness, eventually your life is going to be forgotten. And it makes no difference. So he says, why did I bother? Why did I bother living my life with wisdom when I suffer the same fate as the fools? Ecclesiastes is not a book meant to be taken in chunks like this. I want to preface that. That's why we started this series out by going to the last chapter. Ecclesiastes is not something that's meant for you to take small portions of and try to digest. The preacher in Ecclesiastes, his message is meant to be taken as a whole. So once again, we point to the end of the book, and he says, I have found that only pleasure in life, the only meaning in life comes from fearing God and keeping his commands. He says, that's my entire duty. That's my entire responsibility. The duty of man is not to be wise. The duty of man is not to walk in light. The duty of man is not to toil. It's not meant, it's the duty of man is not to seek out indulgences or pleasures or possessions or experiences. The duty of man is to fear God and keep his commands. And anything else, trying to add value to our life in any other way, is like grasping at smoke. And at the end of the day, you will end up with nothing for all of your efforts. So we have to keep that ending in mind as we read through Ecclesiastes. Verse 18, he says, I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, and seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. How many of you guys have worked a 24-hour job? What I mean by that is a job where you have 3 shifts and the job operates 24 hours a day. The next shift picks up on what the previous shift left behind. You ever, most of you guys probably worked first shift. That's pretty common, right? Second shift. How many of you came in angry because what the previous shift left you was not nearly what you left the next shift? Yeah? Working on a factory floor. This is we worked production. So we had like bracing and everything else that we produced on this line. And it was the most frustrating thing ever because as the workers, we didn't really care about the numbers. Right? We're painting, upwards of 6,000 and 8,000 braces a day. I don't really care whether that order goes out or not, because at the end of the day, it's not my pocket that gets lined. Right? But what I do care about is that if that product doesn't go out, our entire factory line is going to get yelled at by our manager because it's his pocket that's wilting for it. Right? So there's nothing more frustrating than to sit here and divide it out in your head and you're like, okay, my shift, we can do like 8,000 parts. And then second shift can do 8,000 parts. And so this 24,000 part shift should take us about 4 shifts. And you come in thinking you're going to be on the last part of that order only to find out that only half of the entire order has been done because all of the other shifts have slacked off because, it's of course third shift. So Solomon, he kind of goes through a little bit of this. He says, I hated the work that I've done because I know that the work I do is going to be left to another man. Everything you do in life, we call it legacy. Everything you do in life is going to be left to somebody else. Whether that's good or bad, whether you create something or destroy something, you're leaving it to somebody else. So what value did it have for your life? It's actually something that's been very interesting to contemplate for me. I talk about how I always feel like I'm in between 2 major generations. And I'm raised by my grandfather primarily, and he was an older man from an older generation, and a man's value was found in the work that he did. And if you didn't work, you had no value. And then I have the people that are my age, most of which are even slightly younger than me, who find that they believe they have value because they have value. Their work has nothing to do with their value. They exist, therefore they are valuable, they are special, they are unique. And you have the older generation absolutely despising that entire mindset. Solomon kind of lends to that, though, doesn't he? I mean, is it like that's primarily his point in chapter 2? Listen, all the work you do adds nothing to your value. You do work, but it doesn't make you more valuable than the next guy. In fact, he says it's trying to add value to your life that way is as meaningless as it gets. Because at the end of the day, all you're doing is creating something to leave to somebody else. I like Ecclesiastes because when he preaches, he covers so many different facets of how people view life. He is essentially the author of the Great Equalization. He says your life is as meaningless as that person's life, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's no effort you can take. Verse 24, there is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. You notice it's not the results of his work that he says that you should find pleasurable or that you should seek after. He says, enjoy the work itself. How many of you enjoy your work? Why then do we fault people who don't enjoy their work? Yeah, we tell people, well, you should do it anyways. You should keep at it anyways. Yes, Solomon says, no, the greatest thing you can pursue is to find enjoyment in your work. If you don't find enjoyment in your work, find new work. Because at the end of the day, the work itself has no value. What what the author is really telling us is that the greatest pleasure you can pursue is pleasure in the small things that God blesses you with and commands you to do. God blesses you with food. He blesses you with drink. Take enjoyment in those things because they didn't come by your own hand. He says to find pleasure in the work that you do. Why? God already tells us to do work and to do it to the best of our abilities. Solomon tells us the best you can hope for is to find joy in that process. Kings build up nations, skyscrapers. You look at all the things that man has accomplished in the world. The tallest buildings to the deepest pits. Man has accomplished a great deal of things. How many of them actually are remembered by name? Right? We look at the atomic bomb. Everybody knows about the atomic bomb, right? Despite the horrible things that the atomic bomb did, it was actually a pretty massive accomplishment by men in science. Who can tell me who worked on that bomb? Most of us can name Albert Einstein. And all he did was contribute some of the science. We know the product. Very, very few people actually remember the people who worked on it. We look at things like modern electricity. You can name some of the names, but do you remember what they actually did? Thomas Edison made the light bulb, right? What most people don't know is the vast majority of his understanding of how the light bulb ought to work and does work came from someone else. But nowadays, we don't really look at Tesla as the predecessor for Thomas Edison. We look at him as some nut job who made a lot of really cool science experiments. Fact is, most of the great accomplishments of man, we don't actually remember the men. At the end of the day, we remember certain names because we take history classes, but we remember the product. So what value did those men add to their lives by working on it? Legacy? I mean, in the grand schemes of eternity, does that legacy stand for anything? You build a house, that's wonderful. You might provide generations of people with a home to live in, but what value does that add to your actual name? Nobody's going to look at you. God himself is not going to look at you as more important than anyone else just because you did that. That's really what Solomon is getting to. That's what this author, this preacher is trying to turn us to, is understanding we are all on this equal playing field, and there's no point in trying to pursue a greater value. There is no such thing. Look at this. Verse 25, for apart from him, this is God, who can eat or who can have enjoyment, for to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a striving after the wind. So we end this whole message with Solomon reiterating that whether you're somebody who's accomplished a lot or somebody who's accomplished nothing at all, you're in the same general vicinity of each other as far as value goes. Now, the only thing we have is him saying that there is value in pleasing God. But notice here he talks about pleasing God apart from actual works. He says there's works that are going to be given to the people who displease God. But whether God is pleased has nothing to do with the work itself. It's the effect of pleasing God, not the cause. There are times in our heads that we don't view people the same way. We don't really think about things like this. There's so many people that believe people's inherent value or the things that they do in this world. Do you not realize that their value is reflected on whether they obey God or not what they actually do for the world itself? There are so many of us that are raised to believe that the things we leave behind is what defines our life. The author of Ecclesiastes tells us it is the one you serve that provides value and meaning to your life. Whether you clean lavatories for a living or whether you save lives for a living. What this is really pointing to is the concept that every life, no matter what is done with that life, every life is paid for by the same blood from the same Son of God. As we've talked about before, God decided your value when he set that price. God decided that the value of redeeming you to him was worth the life of his Son. At that moment, your value was set. And there is nothing at all that you can do to take away from or add to that value. You can pursue all the pleasure in life you want to, but when God calls you home, you will realize that it was a pointless endeavor. You can seek to leave behind all the landmarks you want to, build all the greatest buildings, build an empire for yourself. But when God calls you home, you have the same value as the man who served under you. And it will all have been pointless. Little more than a passing of the days. It is important, it is vital that when we look to each other, when we look at one another, we look at each other through the lens of God, through the lens of eternity, through the lens of a loving, sacrificing Christ. You're not worthless because of the things you do or don't do with your life. You're not worthless even because you accept or don't accept the things that I know to be true. You are worth everything because God decided you are worth everything. Man, how much easier it would be for us to get along, to be unified, when we truly view each other as having that kind of value. How much more difficult would it be for us to find hate in our hearts when we look at every single individual as somebody who Jesus Christ truly died for? Whether you accept it or not, has nothing to do with me, has nothing to do with how I view you. Because the fact is, Jesus died for you, whether you like it or not. That's the value God has assigned to you. That's the value I must see you as having. And it doesn't matter if you serve me or I serve you. It is vital that we teach people this value. We talk about spreading the gospel. We talk about making disciples, doing evangelism. We talk about telling people about Jesus Christ. But what we oftentimes don't talk about is one of the primary functions of sharing the gospel with somebody is helping somebody to see themselves through that value. Helping somebody to understand just how much God decided that they were worth. The weight of this, you are never going to teach somebody they're worth that if you don't treat them like they're worth that. That's the love of Christ that we are all called to employ, that we are all called to emulate, that we are all called to strive for. The sharing, the experience of loving somebody so much that we know beyond any doubt that God would sacrifice his life for them. Not only enduring a man's death, but enduring all the torments of a man's life. When we start treating each other like we have that value, they'll start believing us when we tell them. Understand that this value is not inherently what saves us. It is what provides us an opportunity to be saved. It is the fact that God values us in such a way that leads him to offering us the grace that leads to eternity. That grace is ours to claim through our obedience, through our own faith. By the grace of God, you are afforded an opportunity to share in Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection so that one day you too may share in his ascension. To share in eternity with the Father who values you so very much. Grace is a gift given to us because of our obedience. That is what it means to obey the gospel. And so we ask today, have you obeyed the gospel? Have you obeyed this value, this inherent view of yourself that God provides? And if you haven't, we ask that you take that step. As Ecclesiastes teaches us, there is no meaning outside of this. There is no point in your life where you will see yourself as truly having value without that. Because what greater value could you pursue than for God to be willing to sacrifice himself for you? What greater value could you possibly have? So this morning we afford you an opportunity for obedience, for an opportunity for a sharing of burdens, whether you need prayers this morning, whether you need to speak with somebody about some struggle you're going through, whether or not you have accepted Jesus Christ. If you need an opportunity to obey that faith this morning, to acquire, to achieve that grace that God affords you through the waters of baptism, through the remission of your sins and the reception of the Holy Spirit, whatever your needs are this morning, we ask that you bring them forward and make them known so that we can help you see them met. as we stand and sing.